Title: The Legend of Flint. Action thriller adventure dark fantasy. Synopsis. After betraying his assassin's oath and helping Koda bring down Malgrin, Shadow, the panther assassin, finds himself marked for death. The Brotherhood of Hunters, led by the ruthless panther elder known as Onyx, does not tolerate failure or disobedience. For breaking their most sacred rule, fulfilling every contract no matter the cost, Shadow is given a choice: die at their hands or take on a mission designed to be his execution. Sent deep into a hostile land, Shadow must hunt a target that no assassin has ever returned from. But as he uncovers dark secrets about the Brotherhood, he realizes he was never meant to survive. With enemies closing in and his past haunting him, Shadow must decide: will he continue to run from his fate, or will he turn the hunt around and bring the fight to those who betrayed him? The hunter has become the hunted, and this time, he won't run. Chapter 1. The night was thick with fog, curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. Shadow moved swiftly, his paws silent against the ground, his breath steady despite the sharp sting in his side. The wound was fresh, a deep gash just beneath his ribs, a painful reminder that he was no longer the predator. He was the prey. They had found him. He had known this moment would come. The Brotherhood never let traitors walk free. He had broken the sacred oath, and now they were here to collect their debt in blood. A distant rustle in the trees made his ears twitch. Shadow pressed himself against the trunk of an oak tree, his dark fur blending into the shadows. His heart pounded, but not from fear. No, fear was for those who still clung to hope. Shadow had abandoned that long ago. A whisper of movement, then silence. They were close. A flash of silver, too fast to see, but not too fast to dodge. Shadow twisted just in time as a throwing knife embedded itself in the bark where his head had been moments before. He rolled and sprang into the underbrush just as three figures emerged from the darkness. The first was a lynx, lean and wiry, his amber eyes glowing like embers. Beside him, a mountain lion, towering and broad, his claws already unsheathed. But it was the third figure that made Shadow's blood run cold. A panther. Not just any panther. Onyx, the elder of the Brotherhood. "You disappoint me, Shadow," Onyx said. "Did you really think you could run forever?" Shadow said nothing. Words wouldn't save him. Onyx stepped forward, the moonlight catching his jet-black fur. "You know the law. A contract, once taken, is sacred. You were sent to kill Koda. Instead, you helped him destroy the very empire that hired us." His golden eyes darkened. "Do you have anything to say before we correct your mistake?" Shadow's muscles weakened. 3 against 1. Maybe more hiding in the trees. He could run, but they would find him again. He could fight, but... No, there was another way. Shadow exhaled, lowering his stance just slightly. "Let me guess. You didn't come all this way just to put me down. You have something else in mind." The lynx let out a low growl, but Onyx only smiled. "Clever as always." Onyx circled him slowly, his tail swaying. "There's a way to reclaim your honor. One final job. Succeed, and your past is erased. Fail, and, well, I assume you know what happens to failed assassins." Shadow replied. "And what makes you think I'd take it?" Onyx's smile widened. "Because if you refuse, we kill you now." Silence. Shadow had no illusions. This wasn't a second chance. It was a death sentence wrapped in the illusion of choice. Whatever this mission was, they expected him to die completing it. But a dead panther couldn't seek revenge. His eyes met Onyx's. "Tell me the job." The panther's grin turned sharp. "Good boy." Chapter 2. The campfire danced between them. Onyx sat with the stillness of a predator in wait, his golden eyes gleaming in the light. Shadow remained standing, his every muscle wound tight, prepared for anything. He wasn't foolish enough to think he was safe just because they hadn't killed him yet. Onyx let the silence stretch, savoring the tension. The lynx and mountain lion flanked him, watching Shadow like he was already dead meat. Then, finally, the panther spoke. "The target is an exile," Onyx said. "A traitor, much like yourself. Someone who once stood among us, but turned their back on the Brotherhood's laws." Shadow said nothing. He wasn't naive. Onyx wouldn't send him after just anyone. "Name?" he asked. Onyx leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Flint." The name hit like a hammer. Shadow's claws flexed involuntarily. Flint was more than just a rogue assassin. He was a legend, a hunter so skilled and ruthless that even the Brotherhood spoke of him in whispers. A panther who had once trained Shadow himself. A panther who had disappeared years ago. "You want me to kill Flint?" Shadow asked, keeping his voice steady. Onyx's grin widened. "I want you to find him. Kill him if necessary. But more importantly, I want you to learn why he vanished. He was one of the best. If he abandoned the Brotherhood, there must be a reason. And I intend to know what that reason is." This wasn't just a test. This was a setup. If the Brotherhood couldn't find Flint themselves, it meant one of two things. Either Flint was already dead, or he had become something even more dangerous than before. Either way, Shadow was being sent to die. "You're giving me a death sentence," he said, eyes narrowing. Onyx laughed softly. "Oh, Shadow, you wound me. Consider it an opportunity. You don't have many of those left." Shadow knew there was no walking away. Not now. The Brotherhood would hunt him until his last breath if he refused. So he played the only card he had left. "Fine," he said. "But I don't work alone." The lynx let out a sharp hiss. "You don't make demands." Onyx held up a paw, silencing the outburst. He studied Shadow carefully. "Who do you have in mind?" Shadow smiled. "A fox and a bear." The panther knew exactly who Shadow meant. "Vex and Grim," Onyx murmured. "Interesting choices." He tilted his head, then gave a slow nod. "Very well. But make no mistake, Shadow, if you betray the Brotherhood again, there will be no negotiations. No second chances. Only death." Shadow met his gaze without flinching. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Hours later, Shadow was slipping through the forest, moving swiftly toward the hidden outpost where Vex and Grim had gone to ground. His body was tense. This wasn't just about survival anymore. If Flint had truly turned his back on the Brotherhood, then he knew something Shadow didn't. And Shadow intended to find out exactly what it was. Even if it meant becoming the hunted once more. Chapter 3. The hidden outpost was buried deep within the ruins of an abandoned temple, a place forgotten by time and swallowed by the jungle. Shadow moved like a ghost through the dense foliage, his ears pricked for any sign of danger. He knew Vex. The fox was paranoid to the bone. There would be traps, alarms, hidden sentries. Sure enough, just as he stepped over a fallen log, something clicked beneath his paw. "Here we go." Shadow didn't flinch as the ground beneath him gave way. A pit, lined with sharpened stakes, yawned open to swallow him whole. But he was faster. His claws lashed out, catching the edge of the pit just in time. A familiar chuckle rang out above him. "You're getting slow, Shadow." He looked up to see Vex, perched lazily on a tree branch, his orange fur glowing under the moonlight. The fox twirled a dagger between his nimble fingers, amusement dancing in his eyes. Shadow smiled. "Or maybe you're getting predictable." Vex snorted. "Touché." A heavy rumble of laughter followed, and Shadow turned his head just in time to see Grim, the massive grizzly bear, emerge from the shadows. His presence was as towering as ever, his battle-scarred body a testament to the fights he had survived. "It's been a while," Grim said. "Not long enough," Shadow muttered, pulling himself out of the pit. "Still as charming as ever, I see," Grim said. Vex hopped down from the tree, landing gracefully beside them. "So, what brings the great Shadow back to us?" Finally decided to stop running. Shadow's grin faded. He wasn't here for jokes. "I need your help." Vex's ears perked up. "Oh, this should be good." Shadow exhaled, glancing between them. "The Brotherhood sent me after a ghost. A panther named Flint." Silence. Vex's playful smile vanished. Grim's expression changed. They knew the name. And that meant trouble. Shadow crossed his arms. "I take it you've heard of him." Grim grunted. "More than just heard of him." "Flint isn't a target, Shadow. He's a warning." Shadow frowned. "What do you mean?" Vex's golden eyes gleamed in the dark. "I mean, if the Brotherhood wants him dead, then they're afraid of him. And if they're afraid of him..." Grim finished the sentence. "Then maybe we should be too." Shadow felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. For the first time since he had received his mission, he started to wonder. What the hell am I walking into? Chapter 4. The night was thick with the scent of burning wood as Shadow, Vex, and Grim moved silently through the jungle. The Brotherhood had given Shadow a name, but no location. That was fine. Flint might be a ghost, but even ghosts left whispers in the wind. And Shadow knew exactly where to start listening. A small black market town, hidden deep in the ruins of an old fortress, was their first stop. A place where mercenaries, criminals, and deserters gathered in the dark, far from the reach of any law. Vex led the way, his eyes darting over the crumbling buildings. "Word is, Flint's been seen here before. If anyone knows where he is, it'll be the informants." Shadow wasn't convinced. "Or it's a trap." Grim rumbled. "Wouldn't be the first time." They moved through the town like shadows themselves, slipping past drunken bandits and wary merchants. It was a place where trust was a currency long lost. Vex led them to an old tavern, its wooden sign barely hanging on by a rusted chain. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. All eyes landed on them as they entered. Shadow ignored the stares and walked straight to the bar. The bartender, an old badger with scars, eyed him warily. "We're looking for someone," Shadow said, sliding a silver coin across the counter. The badger grunted, pocketing the coin without breaking eye contact. "Ain't we all?" Vex leaned in. "The name's Flint. Heard of him?" The badger stiffened. That was answer enough. Grim's massive frame loomed over the bar. "Where is he?" The badger's eyes darted to the back door. Shadow's instincts kicked in. Someone was already moving. "Outside, now," he barked. They spun just in time to see a hooded figure slipping into the alley. Shadow bolted. The chase was on. Through the alley, over crates, through the tight twists of the ruined fortress town, Shadow pushed harder, but whoever this was, they were fast. Too fast. They broke out into a clearing, and the figure was gone. Vex cursed as he caught up. What the hell was that? Grim arrived a second later, breathing heavily. They were leading us somewhere. Shadow's claws flexed. And then he saw it. A single mark carved into the stone wall. A wolf's eye. Flint's mark. Vex exhaled. Guess we found him. Shadow's gaze darkened. Or he found us. Chapter 5. The night air was too quiet. Shadow could feel it. The kind of silence that wasn't peace, but a warning. Grim's ears twitched. Something ain't right. Vex had already drawn his daggers. Yeah, no kidding. That was way too easy. Shadow's claws curled slightly as he took a slow step forward. The ruins stretched before them, the carved wolf's eye on the stone wall staring back, mocking them. A challenge. Or a trap. Shadow took a breath, lowering his voice. Stay sharp. If Flint wanted us dead, we'd already be corpses. But if he wants us caught. The ground exploded beneath them. Ropes lashed up like striking vipers, and before Shadow could leap away, his limbs were wrenched from the ground. Grim roared as a steel net slammed over him, pinning his massive frame. Vex twisted midair, barely avoiding the first trap, only for a second wire to snap tight around his ankle, yanking him upside down. Shadow snarled, thrashing against the vines, but whoever set these traps knew exactly what they were doing. A slow clap echoed from the darkness. And then a voice, smooth and edged like a sharpened blade, slipped through the night. Well, the traitor panther finally walks into the den. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. Flint. A panther, but older, battle-worn, and with a gaze that had seen too much blood. His dark fur was streaked with old scars, and around his neck hung a pendant, the insignia of the Brotherhood. The same Brotherhood that now wanted Shadow dead. Flint said, "I was wondering when you'd come looking for me." Shadow's muscles coiled. "Was this your plan? To bait us into a trap like cowards?" Flint chuckled. "No, this is just insurance. You don't walk away from betraying the Brotherhood, Shadow. And you sure as hell don't come looking for me like I owe you a favor." Vex, still hanging upside down, muttered, "Yeah, we got it, you're very scary. Can we skip to the part where we kill you?" Flint's smirk widened. "Cute." Torches lit up the ruins. And they weren't alone. Dozens of figures emerged from the darkness. Wolves, panthers, foxes, the Brotherhood. Vex swore. Grim growled. Shadow knew. They were already surrounded. Flint said, "You should have stayed away, Shadow. You led them straight to me." The noose tightened. Chapter 6. The Brotherhood closed in, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. "No way out. Drop your weapons. Make this easy," one of the hunters said, facing Flint. Shadow's ears twitched. He wasn't just watching Flint, he was listening. The rustle of shifting boots, the weight of the net over Grim, the tension in the rope holding Vex upside down. Every sound was a clue. Every heartbeat a countdown. He exhaled. Then he moved. Snap. With a fierce twist, Shadow yanked his bound wrists apart, slicing the ropes with the hidden blade on his bracer. Flint's eyes widened too late. Shadow lunged, slamming his shoulder into one of the hunter's chest, sending him staggering back. "No!" Shadow roared. Grim flexed, his monstrous strength tearing the net apart. He grabbed the nearest hunter, lifting him like a rag doll and hurling him into the crowd. Vex, still upside down, swung himself up with a grunt, yanking a dagger from his belt and slicing through the rope. He dropped, landed on a panther's shoulders, and drove his blade down. The Brotherhood swarmed, weapons flashing in the firelight. Shadow ducked under a swinging blade, twisting behind a jaguar and slamming his fist into his ribs. The jaguar stumbled, just in time for Shadow to spin kick him into another attacker. Grim rampaged through the fray, fists like battering rams, sending hunters flying. Vex moved like a phantom, weaving between enemies, daggers flashing as he struck pressure points, throats, and weak spots. But they were outnumbered. And the Brotherhood was relentless. Flint had disappeared. Shadow blocked a strike, only for another blade to slice across his arm. He hissed, blood dripping onto the stone. Vex staggered, a spear grazing his side. "Little help here." Grim let out a pained roar, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. They weren't winning. They were surviving. For now. They needed an opening, a way out. Then he saw it. A crumbling archway, barely holding under the weight of time. Weak. Breakable. Shadow grabbed Grim's massive arm. "Bring it down." Grim growled, but he understood. With a furious roar, he charged, his massive frame colliding with the archway. Crack! The stone groaned. Crash! The entire structure collapsed, sending a cloud of dust through the ruins. A wall of rubble separated them from the Brotherhood. For now. Shadow coughed, pulling Vex to his feet. "Move. Now." They ran. Bleeding, wounded, but alive. For now. Chapter 7. The cold wind bit through their wounds as they stumbled through the forest. Shadow's arm throbbed, his blood staining the bandages Vex had hastily wrapped around it. Grim's breathing was labored, the arrow wound slowing him down. They needed shelter. Fast. They pressed on, the ruins disappearing behind them. Hours passed in painful silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Every shadow felt like a hunter waiting to strike. Finally, they found it. A hidden cavern, concealed behind thick vines. The entrance was narrow, just enough for them to squeeze through. Inside, it was cool, dark, and safe for now. Grim collapsed against the stone wall with a deep grunt. Vex slid down beside him, exhausted. Shadow, despite his pain, stood guard. His instincts wouldn't let him rest. That's when he heard it. A soft crunch of footsteps. His dagger was in his hand instantly. "Easy, brother," a voice murmured from the shadows. Flint. Alive. Where has he been? Flint disappeared during the fight, but why? Did he lead the Brotherhood away to help them escape? Or did he have his own plan all along? As the fire crackled softly, Flint's gaze was distant, as if he were staring into the past. His fur was damp with sweat, his breathing uneven, but his eyes held no fear, only the weight of something heavier than regret. "I didn't leave the Brotherhood because I was weak," he said at last. "I left because I saw the truth." Shadow frowned. "What truth?" Flint exhaled slowly. "The Brotherhood is a lie. We were raised to believe we were mercenaries bound by honor, but in reality, we're just weapons for hire, tools in the hands of those ruthless enough to buy our loyalty. We're told we serve the highest bidder, but that's not the real rule, is it?" Shadows stayed silent, but he knew what Flint meant. "The real rule," Flint continued, "is that we must never betray a contract. No matter what. Even if we discover that we're on the wrong side of justice, even if the mission is morally corrupt, we are expected to follow through without question." His claws clenched against the stone floor. "I was ordered to assassinate a mother and her cubs, Shadow." His voice broke slightly, but he quickly hardened. She was an exiled noble. A rival kingdom had put a price on her head. She had done nothing wrong except exist. The firelight cast shadows across Flint's face as he whispered, "And I was expected to kill her anyway." Vex's ears flattened. Grim let out a slow, heavy sigh. "And you refused?" Flint nodded. "I let them go. I covered their tracks. But the Brotherhood found out. I broke the code, and for that, they marked me a traitor. They hunted me. If I hadn't disappeared that night, they would have made an example out of me." He looked up at Shadow. "They still will." A tense silence followed. Shadow stared at the flames, thoughts racing. He had always known the Brotherhood was ruthless, but this was different. This was proof that they weren't warriors. They were executioners. "I don't regret it," Flint murmured. "But now, I need to finish what I started. And that means ending the Brotherhood before they end me." His eyes met Shadow's. "Before they end us both." Chapter 8. Flint had just finished telling his story, the fire casting shadows on his face. Shadow, Vex, and Grim were silent, absorbing the weight of what he had just revealed. The Brotherhood wasn't just a league of assassins. It was a cult of unquestionable loyalty. And now, They were coming. Before anyone could speak, a low whistle echoed through the trees. Flint's head snapped up. Shadow drew his blades in an instant. Vex's ears flattened, eyes darting to the entrance of their hideout. Grim let out a deep, warning growl. The Brotherhood had arrived. But there was no ambush. No arrows flying from the treetops. Instead, a single figure stepped forward. A panther. Drenched in shadows, fur black as night, eyes cold as ice. He moved with deliberate grace, the weight of 100 battles resting on his shoulders. Flint exhaled sharply. Talon. Shadow's grip on his blade tightened. Talon, the right hand of Onyx, second in command of the Brotherhood. If he was here, then Onyx was watching from the shadows. But why wasn't he attacking? Talon stopped a few feet away and reached into his cloak. Shadow was prepared for an attack. But instead of a weapon, Talon pulled out a silver pendant. Flint's breath hitched. The pendant glowed softly in the firelight, an intricately carved symbol of the Old Kingdom, the very one the noblewoman belonged to. Talon turned it between his claws, watching Flint's reaction closely. "If you want to see them alive," he said, "you'll come with me." Silence. A chill ran through the air. Shadow's eyes narrowed. Them? He looked at Flint, expecting confusion, anger, but instead, he saw something far more alarming. Fear. Not for himself. For someone else. Who? Shadow demanded, stepping forward. Who is he talking about, Flint? Flint's jaw locked, his claws digging into his palms. Talon smiled. You never told them, did you? Flint said nothing. Vex called out, Flint. Talon took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. Onyx wants to meet you face to face, traitor. You have until sunrise to decide. His icy gaze moved to Shadow and the others. If you refuse, well, he turned the pendant once more, then they're as good as dead. He tossed the pendant at Flint's feet. Then, without another word, Talon melted back into the night, leaving only silence behind. Flint stared at the pendant, his hands trembling. Shadow exhaled sharply, realization hitting him all at once. Flint didn't just betray the Brotherhood out of duty. He did it for someone. And now, the Brotherhood had them. Shadow asked, Flint, who are they? Flint's gaze darkened. Someone I never should have left behind. The fire crackled. Sunrise was coming. And so was their choice. Chapter 9. Flint sat alone by the dying fire, staring at the pendant in his hands. His mind was a storm. He could still see her face, hear her laugh, feel the warmth of her touch. And now, she was in Onyx's hands. Because of him. He had left her behind to protect her. But that didn't matter anymore. If he didn't go now, she would die. And he couldn't live with that. Shadow's voice broke the silence. Flint, we need to think this through. No, Flint said, standing up. There's nothing to think about. Shadow stepped forward. This is a trap. You know that. Of course, I know that. Flint snapped. But I can't just sit here while they... He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. This isn't your fight, Shadow. Vex answered. You think we're just going to let you walk in there alone? Flint turned away. That's exactly what I think. Shadow stepped closer. Flint, if you do this alone, you're dead. Flint smiled. Then I'll die trying. Before Shadow could respond, Flint was gone. The moment his figure vanished into the darkness, Grim let out a frustrated growl. Shadow cursed under his breath. Damn it. Vex's ears flattened. We should stop him. Shadow exhaled. No. Vex frowned. No. Shadow's gaze hardened, watching the spot where Flint disappeared. He needs to see for himself. The forest was silent as Flint moved through the trees, his steps quick but careful. He had traveled these paths before, back when he was still one of them. Back when he believed in the Brotherhood. Now, he was nothing but a traitor. The wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets of old blood spilled on these very grounds. And Flint knew. He wasn't alone. A branch snapped behind him. His dagger was in his hand in an instant, but before he could turn, a shadow dropped from the trees. Flint barely had time to react before something slammed into his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The moment he hit the dirt, a blade pressed against his throat. A familiar voice chuckled darkly. "I was hoping you'd come alone." Flint's eyes locked onto the panther looming over him. Talon. The right hand of Onyx grinned, pressing the blade closer. Brave, but foolish. Flint didn't flinch. "Take me to him." Talon tilted his head. "So eager to die?" Flint's voice was cold. "Not before I see her." Talon smiled. "You always were predictable." He stepped back, sheathing his blade. "Onyx is waiting." Flint exhaled, standing up slowly. He didn't look back. Because if he did, he might lose his resolve. Meanwhile, back at the hideout, Shadow stood at the edge of the cave, watching the path Flint had taken. Vex moved in frustration. "I hate this." Grim rumbled in agreement. Shadow was silent. He knew Flint wouldn't last alone. But rushing in now would be suicide. No. They needed a plan. He exhaled, his grip tightening around his blade. "Let's go. We're bringing him back." Chapter 10. Flint knelt on the cold stone floor, chains biting into his wrists as the torches circles around him. In front of him, sitting on a grand throne of obsidian and bone, was Onyx. The panther's golden eyes burned with a cold amusement, his massive claws tapping against the armrest. "So," Onyx murmured, leaning forward, "you finally come home, traitor." Flint didn't respond. His gaze was locked on her. Standing at the far end of the chamber, guarded by 2 hunters, was the noblewoman he had been sent to kill. Her emerald eyes filled with tears the moment she saw him. "Flint," she gasped, struggling against her captors. Onyx chuckled. How touching." He stood up, his massive form casting a long shadow over the chamber. "Do you really think I'd make this easy for you, Flint?" Flint exhaled, ignoring the pain in his body. "Onyx, listen to me." "No," Onyx cut him off. "You listen." He gestured to the hunters gathered around them. "These men? They followed you once. They believed in you. And then you betrayed us." Flint responded. "I didn't betray anyone." Onyx laughed. "Oh! You accepted a contract. And instead of fulfilling it, you killed the man who hired you. That is a betrayal of our creed." Flint's eyes burned with defiance. "That creed is a lie." Murmurs rippled through the gathered hunters. Flint saw hesitation in some of their eyes, so he pushed forward. "We were taught that we only kill the wicked. That we serve no kingdom, only justice. But that's not true, is it?" Onyx was furious, but he let him speak. "We've killed for gold. We've murdered innocents. The woman you took," Flint gestured toward her, "was no criminal. She was a mother. And you sent me to murder her." Silence. Some of the hunters shifted uncomfortably. Onyx exhaled slowly. "Your words are empty without proof." Flint's hands clenched into fists. "You know it's true." Onyx laughed. "It doesn't matter." Then, he snapped his fingers. Talon stepped forward, his sword gleaming under the torchlight. Onyx's voice was calm but deadly. "If you want your woman and her child to live, you'll fight." He tilted his head. You always did love a challenge, Flint. So here's my offer. He raised a hand. All of my deadliest hunters will fight you, one by one. Defeat them all, and you walk free. Flint's heart pounded. He knew what this was. A game. A punishment. Onyx knew he wouldn't survive. But Flint smiled. Because he had no other choice. The first hunter lunged. Flint dodged, his chains snapping apart as he grabbed a dagger from his opponent's belt and drove it into his ribs. The man collapsed instantly. Another came. And another. Flint moved like a storm, his blades slicing through the air. The crowd of hunters watched in awe as one by one, their best fighters fell before him. But time was not on his side. With every kill, his movements slowed. With every strike, his wounds deepened. His breathing was ragged. His arms burned. But still, he stood. Onyx chuckled from his throne. Impressive. Flint wiped blood from his lip, chest heaving. Then, the final opponent stepped forward. Talon. Flint's stomach tightened. He knew he had nothing left. Talon said, I'd tell you to rest, but he cracked his knuckles. This won't take long. Flint barely had time to blink before Talon's fist collided with his ribs. A sickening crack echoed. Flint staggered back, gasping. Talon didn't stop. A knee to the gut. An elbow to the jaw. A blade slicing across his back. Flint's world blurred with pain. The strength drained from his legs. And then, Talon's fist slammed into his face, sending him crashing onto the stone floor. He didn't get up. Blood pooled beneath him, his vision swimming in darkness. Talon wiped the blood off his blade, looking at Onyx. He's done. Onyx stood, walking forward slowly. He crouched beside Flint's broken body, his voice soft. Did you really think you could win? Flint coughed, blood dripping from his lips. He could barely keep his eyes open. But still, he smiled. Because he had fought until the end. Chapter 11. Flint could barely breathe. The taste of blood was thick in his mouth, his body broken and trembling. His fingers dug weakly into the cold stone floor, but there was no strength left to rise. Talon stood over him, a towering shadow of death. The tip of his blade gleamed under the torchlight raised high. And then, an arrow sliced through the air, aiming straight for Talon's throat. But Talon was no fool. With unnatural reflexes, he snatched the arrow mid-flight, snapping it in half with his fingers. The room fell into stunned silence. Talon shouted, turning toward the entrance. Really? I expected better. A voice echoed through the hall. Fine, then try this. A blur of motion, then a boot collided with Talon's chest, sending him crashing into a pile of broken chairs. Gasps rippled through the gathered hunters. Standing in the archway, his bow still in hand, was Shadow. His cloak billowed, his eyes gleaming with cold fury. Behind him, Grim and Vex stepped forward, blades drawn. Flint, still lying on the ground, coughed and said, Took you long enough. Vex scoffed. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want us to let you die for dramatic effect? Grim crossed his arms. Would have been a lot quieter. A dry chuckle escaped Flint. Despite the pain, he felt hope. But Onyx remained unfazed. The panther sat back in his throne, watching them with mild amusement. Ah, so the lost dogs return. And what do you want? To die alongside the traitor? Shadow took a step forward, eyes locked onto Onyx. No, he said. We came for the truth. The hunters shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at Flint bruised, broken, but still alive. Some looked at Onyx calm, composed, but unbothered by the betrayal. Then Shadow tossed something onto the ground. A sealed document. "What is this?" Onyx asked. "Proof," Grim said coldly. Vex folded his arms. "You claim to be honorable, Onyx. That we only take jobs that serve justice." He gestured at the document. "Turns out, that's a damn lie." Murmurs rippled through the hunters. Onyx's claws tapped against the armrest. "Explain." Shadow's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Every contract you've taken for the last year has benefited the tyrants of this land." He took another step forward. "You claim to hunt criminals. But the ones we've killed? They weren't the true villains." Vex scoffed. "How convenient that the ones you needed to eliminate were always enemies of the lords and nobles who paid you." A hunter near the edge hesitated. That can't be true." Grim glared at Onyx. "Then ask him." All eyes turned to their leader. "But Onyx?" He laughed. It was a low, rumbling sound, unbothered, confident. "You think this means something?" He stood up slowly, towering over them all. "You fools. You really believe justice was ever real?" The hunters froze. Onyx's golden eyes burned with cold amusement. "Justice is just a word. Power is the only thing that matters. And as long as I sit on this throne, I hold that power." The division began to crack the room. Some hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked at Flint, Shadow, Grim, and Vex with doubt, but not hostility. But others stepped forward, hands on their weapons. "You betrayed the Brotherhood," one hunter snarled. "Onyx made us strong. Without him, we are nothing." Another hesitated. "But if what they're saying is true?" Talon, who had finally risen to his feet, wiped the blood from his lip and scoffed. "Lies. All of it." Flint, still struggling to stand, growled through gritted teeth. "Then tell me this, Onyx." He lifted his gaze, fire still burning in his eyes. "Why did you send me to kill her?" He gestured toward the noblewoman. "Why did you order the death of an innocent woman and her child?" For the first time, Onyx didn't answer immediately. That silence cracked something in the room. A hunter near the back lowered his sword. Another one stepped away from Onyx's side. Then another. And another. Onyx's fingers twitched against his throne. Talon then said with a loud voice, "You're all weak." He spat. "Cowards." Onyx's golden eyes gleamed dangerously. He knew this moment was slipping from his grasp. So he did the only thing he could. He stepped forward and said, "Enough. If you stand with me, you stand with power." He turned his gaze to the hunters who had stepped back. "If you stand against me, you are dead." A heavy silence. Then, one by one, the hunters made their choice. Some stepped beside Onyx, their loyalty unwavering. But others? They turned toward Flint, Shadow, Grim, and Vex. The Brotherhood had been split. Onyx exhaled slowly, his claws flexing. "So be it." He looked at Shadow. "I hope you're ready for war." Shadow's grip on his bow tightened. He smiled coldly. "Oh, I was counting on it." Chapter 12. Onyx sneered. "You think you've won?" His voice was smooth, confident, dripping with arrogance. He straightened his coat, eyes scanning the hunters who had turned against him. "All of you, weaklings, traitors." He took a slow step forward, his voice rising. "You followed me because I made you strong. I gave you purpose. And now, because of a few misguided fools, you're willing to throw it all away." Even some of the hunters who had stepped back hesitated. Shadow's grip on his bow tightened. Flint shifted slightly, still watching Onyx through bloodied eyes. For a moment, it seemed like Onyx might sway them again. And then, a fist slammed into his jaw. A solid, earth-shaking punch that sent Onyx crashing into his throne. Silence. Then, a deep, amused voice broke through the tension. "Spare me the nonsense speech. Let's just fight already." Every head turned. Vex was cracking his knuckles, grinning like a wolf. Flint, still standing weakly, let out a low chuckle. Took the words right out of my mouth. Shadow smiled. "You always hated monologues." Onyx groaned, lifting his head. His nose was bleeding. The room erupted into chaos. The battle had begun. Flint cracked his neck as he slowly stood. His bones ached, his muscles screamed in pain, but it didn't matter anymore. This fight had never been about winning. That's why he took those beatings before. Because he knew even if he defeated Talon earlier, they wouldn't have let him go. So he waited. He endured. Now? He rolled his shoulders, shaking off the pain. He exhaled, wiped the blood off his chin, and smirked at Talon. "My turn." Talon lunged forward, but Flint was ready. A swift step, a dodge, then boom. A solid punch to Talon's back. Talon staggered, shocked. Before he could react, Flint was on him. A knee to the stomach. An elbow to the jaw. A devastating roundhouse kick. Talon was fast. But Flint? He was a storm. Talon barely had time to raise his sword when Flint caught his wrist, twisted it, and delivered a brutal headbutt. Talon stumbled back, blood trickling down his face. Flint wiped his own lip and grinned. "Come on. I thought you were the best." Talon growled, then roared. And the real fight began. Across the room, Shadow and Onyx circled each other. Shadow had fought strong enemies before, but Onyx? He was something else. He moved like a ghost, his attacks precise, controlled, brutal. Shadow fired an arrow, Onyx dodged effortlessly. Shadow swung his dagger, Onyx parried and countered with a strike to the ribs. Shadow gritted his teeth. Fast. Too fast. Onyx smirked. "You're good, but you're not me." He lunged, but Shadow was waiting. A twist. A feint. A sudden drop. Crack. Shadow swept Onyx's legs out from under him. The once mighty leader hit the ground hard. Onyx snarled. "You." A fist to the face. Shadow didn't let him finish. Then another punch. And another. Until Onyx wasn't smirking anymore. He was struggling to breathe. Shadow leaned in, voice low. "You're right. I'm not you." Then he slammed one final punch into Onyx's face, knocking him unconscious. Meanwhile, Vex and Grim were having the time of their lives. Vex dodged a sword swing, grabbed a nearby plate, and smashed it over the guard's head. Grim lifted a guy and threw him over a table. "That was unnecessary," Vex muttered. Grim shrugged. "Felt necessary." Vex rolled his eyes, slamming a boot into another guard's stomach. The two of them tore through Onyx's forces, clearing a path for the noblewoman. Grim quickly freed her and the cub, leading them away from the chaos. "Stay low," he ordered. The woman nodded, holding her cub tightly. It was almost over. Vex stretched. "Well, that was fun." Grim cracked his knuckles. "I could have taken more of them." Flint chuckled weakly, turning to Shadow. "Guess you were right." Shadow smiled. "Of course I was." Flint exhaled, looking at the noblewoman. She was free. Safe. He had won. No, they had won. Final chapter. The sun was just beginning to rise. The once mighty Brotherhood was no more. The hunters who had followed Onyx, scattered, beaten, gone. Flint leaned against a broken pillar, exhausted but victorious. The noblewoman knelt beside him, gently tending to his wounds. Her cub peeked out from behind her, still unsure but curious. Shadow, Vex, and Grim stood nearby, taking in the aftermath. Vex exhaled dramatically. Well, that was fun. Grim cracked his knuckles. Could have taken more of M. Shadow smiled, cleaning his blade. You say that after nearly getting stabbed twice. Grim shrugged. Still standing, aren't I? Flint chuckled weakly. You two never stop, do you? Vex grinned. Not a chance. Then, his grin faded slightly. He looked around at the destruction, at the shattered empire of assassins they had just dismantled. But let's be honest, Vex continued. This doesn't end here. Shadow nodded, understanding immediately. The Brotherhood may be gone, but the people who hired them, the real monsters, they're still out there. Grim folded his arms. And they think they're safe now that Onyx is gone. Vex smirked. I say we prove them wrong. Flint exhaled, glancing at the noblewoman. He reached for her hand, finally allowing himself to just breathe. Not me, he said softly. They all turned to him. Flint smiled tiredly. I've spent too many years fighting. Always running, always bleeding. But now? I just want to live. He squeezed the noblewoman's hand. I have everything I need right here. Vex raised an eyebrow. So what? You're retiring. Flint chuckled. Call it what you want. Grim grinned. Well, good for you. Now we just have to figure out how to take down every corrupt tyrant in the land without getting killed. Vex sighed. Sounds exhausting. Shadow replied. Sounds like a challenge. They all shared a look. And just like that, the next hunt was decided. Just as they were about to leave, a voice called out from the shadows. So, you took out the Brotherhood without me? Now you want to do this again? Everyone froze. Shadow's eyes narrowed. Vex groaned. Oh, great. From the shadows, Koda stepped forward. The wild rogue. The unpredictable force. The chaos they never planned for. Koda looked around at the aftermath, then said, You guys really don't know how to throw a party without me, huh? Flint chuckled. You're late. Koda stretched lazily. Nah, I just let you guys do all the boring work first. He grinned. Now we get to the fun part. Vex rubbed his temples. This is going to be a nightmare. Grim laughed. More like an adventure. Shadow simply smiled. Then let's get started. As the group set off on their new mission, Flint stayed behind, watching them disappear into the horizon. He wasn't running toward danger. He was running toward peace. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Because trouble? It always had a way of finding them. To be continued.